you know, my scientific career, people are always asking, how can a scientist become a politician? And the answer is, we're all politicians. We all deal with politics every day. Of course, Izzy is a real political person, and I mean, but we all do it every day, every day. So how did I get into this? Well, you know, when I was in college, I was a Republican then, and I volunteered to work for Lindsay for mayor. He then bankrupted the city. Then I was a postdoc at Caltech after finishing my PhD at Columbia, and McGovern was running. And I wanted to see the war end. I wanted to see more women's rights, and so I was out there working for McGovern, and I became a Democrat. I walked precincts, I registered voters, and I was out there, and then we came back to New York where I was working for NASA at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies there. And I continued to work for McGovern. And I'll tell you, in my precinct on the west side of New York, there was a landslide for McGovern. So later on, when I moved to California, I got involved, and since 1988, until my election to City Council in 2012, I was always, 2004, I was always the person who organized the precinct workers. And after that, I continued to be involved in getting people out to vote, campaigning, etc. So on City Council, well, but my life as a scientist also prepared me. When I was doing climate research, of course that was intensely political, although at the time we did it. So when I started in the 1970s, computers were brand new. We could do things we never did before. So for my thesis, I created one of the first models of the evolution of the galaxy, starting from a gas cloud condensing, and now we know it doesn't exactly happen that way. But anyway, starting from a gas cloud condensing into stars and developing spiral arms. But it was also the first model that ever had gas dynamics of any kind in it. So it was a real breakthrough there. Then I was a postdoc at Caltech. I came back to NASA. The funding for astrophysics had gone away, and I got into climate research. And I developed, again, one of the first models that has ever been used to look at climate around the world, and developed the first scientific paper which showed that there could be a feedback between what happens to the environment, what people can do to the environment in terms of not CO2, that was being done as well, but in terms of changing the biosphere. That if you cut down all the plants, you're going to get less rain, and you'll continue to get less rain, and you'll get desertification. So there's real feedbacks of all sorts of kinds. So I did that, and of course you always had to work to get your grants and get your time on the computer. But when I really got involved was when I, for a variety of reasons, I ended up at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, first doing climate research, and then when Reagan cut out all of that funding, getting involved in nuclear weapons design, which was actually probably the most important thing that ever happened to me, because there aren't many liberal Democrats doing nuclear weapons design. And so there are obviously things that I would do that others would not do. One of them was people were very concerned about the plutonium fabrication facility, the plutonium and nuclear weapon fabrication facility in Rocky Flats. It was a real danger to the people of Denver. There had already been a major fire. We almost had plutonium oxide spread across the whole Denver metropolitan area. What I showed was that with the plutonium parts that we'd made already, we didn't have to make any new ones. We could actually design weapons which could go into new missiles without developing new plutonium parts. We were able to shut down Rocky Flats. I have many friends who were, you know, sitting on the railroad tracks, stopping the trains, and I've told them, yeah, but I stopped Rocky Flats. later on, one of the things that Lawrence Livermore Lab, where I worked in Los Alamos, didn't want was a nuclear comprehensive test ban treaty. But when Clinton was elected, he very much wanted one, and there was a series of negotiations which reached a deadlock. And the U.S. position was there should be no nuclear test above 4 pounds of explosive yield. No more nuclear detonation that's bigger than that, which is pretty damn small because we were doing hundreds of kilotons, hundreds of thousands of tons. But the Chinese had an objective of hundreds of tons of explosive yield for the nuclear weapons, and the Russians had 10 tons, and there was really no consensus. And one of the reasons there was no consensus is nobody believed that the U.S. somehow wasn't smarter than the rest of them, and we could do things at 4 pounds that they couldn't. And that was one of the things stopping people from going to our 4-pound limit. So I developed a presentation based upon science and upon what we knew about the other parties and where they might go. And I said there are 3 ways we could settle this. We could have the limit at 0, because people know what that means and they know we're not going to be able to do more than they can do. We could set the limit at 10 tons, which is what the Russians want. Everybody understands that. And then we could make it at hundreds of tons, the way the Chinese and the French want it. Now, the lab, I don't know that I have any friends from the lab here, but the lab management, oh, it'll be hundreds of tons. We could send Bill off. I knew they were going to pick 0, because these are people who really wanted a comprehensive test. I can tell you the non-nuclear weapons, had we agreed on hundreds of tons, would have said this isn't a nuclear test ban. Now, it would have been hundreds of tons as opposed to hundreds of thousands, but it still is, they still would have felt we were testing. Anyway, I briefed, at that time I had help from the the Natural Resources Defense Council. They introduced me to the key people in the Department of Energy who would be making the recommendations to the president about how we would change our negotiation position. With their introduction, I gave a presentation to the fellow. I told my boss he couldn't come with me. Anyway, I made a presentation. I made a public one, but then I talked to him privately, and that's the one I didn't allow my boss to come to. And I briefed him on a Wednesday. On the next weekend, they were briefed at the White House. We changed our negotiation position that week, and the next weekend we had a treaty. So that's how science can influence things. But notice, there was also a very deliberate value. We put a value, as Izzy has. She talked to you about her values, and her values forced her to find the science. So it's not only the science that matters, it's the values. And that's critical. And in fact, that's how decisions are made in the Assembly. Now, the Assembly is probably different. The Assembly, the Senate in California. First of all, remember, it's much smaller than it is in DC. We only have 80 Assembly members, only 40 senators. Our Assembly members represent almost 500,000 people. In the rest of the country, it's typically 10 to 20,000. So it's a very different place. It's a smaller place, which has its advantages and disadvantages. I have less contact with people in my district than I'd like, but it's easier to talk to people because I can't imagine being lost in the House of Representatives, 435 people. Much easier, believe me, with 80 in the California Assembly. But there are people who manage. But it's very different than DC. First of all, we do pass laws because, of course, we have 52 Democrats and only 28 Republicans, and we have a Democratic governor who is the right man for the job, although not always right, particularly when he vetoes my bills. Anyway, so we have Republicans, and they actually do work together. About half the time, everybody votes for what's going on up there. The other half of the time, there's usually people who cross over from both parties. There's only a few votes in the year that are strict party line votes. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that we no longer have a 2/3 vote for the budget. Now, why does that matter? It matters, and you can tell me about this because I wasn't there at the time, because the Republicans have gotten to the point where they would say, unless you give us everything we want, we won't give you a budget, and you need a 2/3 vote, so you need some of ours. And if somebody broke ranks, they would then recall them. So that meant that you were in session all summer long, into the fall, everybody got mad at everybody else. Well, now this is a majority vote. That doesn't happen. A second thing that's happened is we have nonpartisan redistricting. So there are more swing districts than there used to be. There's about 10 or 12 now, not all of which are up every year, but there are about 10 or 12 districts. In addition, we've got the top 2 primary. This does result in more moderates being elected, and I love moderate Republicans, but I sometimes have my problems with moderate Democrats. And actually, the environmental caucus the number of environmental folks is declining in the Democratic Party, and climbing somewhat, as with the person that Izzy mentioned, Brian Dolly, in the Republican Party. So we'll see how that goes over time. So how do I use science? And I think the first example I'll give you is, now here I am, PhD in astrophysics, expert in climate change, expert in energy and telecommunications. What did they tell me to chair? Public safety. Now, that shows you that I am a politician too, and they chose me for that because I was on the committee last year. I was on Tom Amiano, who those of you from the Bay Area have probably heard of, is a very hard left kind of guy. 3 minutes, okay. He's a very hard left kind of guy. I was with him 100% of the time, except when he was too far right for me. So they put me in charge because they want to kill all the bills that are lock them up and throw away the key bills, because they're hard for a lot of people to vote on. They're relatively easy for me. Because I come from a very liberal district in Alameda County. But we now are going to look at police use of force. Now, at a local level, and you heard from someone talking about local, you get to have 3 meetings on an important topic. In the legislature, you get to have 10 minutes to hear a bill on an important topic, and you hear dueling experts who disagree with one another, and you don't know who to believe. My approach to this has been, let's get out the facts. And we're going to have a lot of bills on, guess what, police use of force, because we're talking about that all the time. So I've gotten together with Lonnie Hancock, the chair of the Senate committee, and the head of she's also, besides being head of public safety, she's head of the budget subcommittee that deals with public safety. And I also have the assembly person who deals with the budget on public safety, Reggie Jones Sawyer, who happens to be chair of the African American Caucus. And we're going to have a couple of days of testimony about what are the statistics, how many police officers are killed, how do we prevent those deaths, how many civilians are killed, how do we present those deaths, what are the facts, what are the best practices, does police use of cameras make a difference? What sort of training do you need? So this is my training as a scientist, and this will serve me well in public safety. Now I'll also use that same as we're dealing with climate issues and energy issues. I will use that same approach, the facts. There will be more noticeably scientific facts, but the scientific method is useful in almost everything you do. It means looking for the facts. It means looking at what did make a difference. And that is how science can educate us. And I will tell you that members of the legislature call up my office and say, well, what does Bill think about this? Because they know I've listened to the facts. They know I make decisions based on the facts. They respect me for that. And let me say that there are 3 other engineers. There are a about 7 PhDs. We're a very educated group. And while I do agree with Vern and what he showed you, that is the way it happens. People do listen to the facts. They listened on the fracking legislation. We got good fracking legislation out. They've listened on some energy bills, and they will be listening, I assure you, on public safety bills as well. What are the facts? What works? That's what's important.